The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers, the warmth from her breath, the hope from her heart. Alara's hands were raw, chapped red and bleeding in the frigid air as she split another log. The axe felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight she had to lift and swing again and again and again. Each impact sent a jarring shock up her arms, a dull ache that settled deep in her bones. She was an omega, the lowest of the low. A ghost in her own pack, visible only when there was a chore no one else wanted. Her parents were gone, lost to a border skirmish years ago, leaving her with nothing but their shame. They had been weak, they said, and their weakness was a stain she could never wash away. So she chopped wood in the biting wind while the others sat by the fire in the great hall, their laughter a distant, cruel music. Hunger was a familiar knot in her belly, a constant companion. A shadow fell over the chopping block. Alara didn't need to look up to know who it was. The path was treacherous, and the ice near the banks was thin. It was a dangerous task in this weather, a task for 2 strong pack members, not one half-frozen omega. "The ice," Alara began, but the word died on her lips as Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Are you refusing a task?" Lyra's voice dropped to a purr, the sound more menacing than any shout. "You know the punishment for disobedience, don't you, orphan?" Alara flinched. She knew. The lash, the cold cell, the denial of even the meager scraps she was usually given. She nodded, her gaze falling back to the snow. "Good girl." Lyra gave her a shove that sent her stumbling. "Now hurry up, and try not to fall in. No one would bother to pull you out." With that parting shot, Lyra swept back toward the warmth of the longhouse, leaving Alara alone with the scattered wood and the biting wind. She gritted her teeth against a fresh wave of despair. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Painfully, she bent and began to gather the logs, her frozen fingers protesting with every movement. She worked until the pile was neat again, her back screaming in protest. Then she picked up the heavy wooden buckets and began the long, treacherous walk to the river. The wind sliced like claws, tearing at her thin cloak. Snow swirled around her, a blinding white veil that obscured the path. She had to feel her way with her feet, praying she wouldn't misstep. What was happening to me? The question was a constant, silent scream in her mind. Why was she born to this life? To be nothing, to be worthless, to be a tool for others' cruelty. She pushed the thoughts away. They were a weakness she couldn't afford. She just had to survive this trip, then the next, and the one after that. Survival was the only victory she could hope for. The roar of the river grew louder, a hungry sound beneath the howl of the wind. The blizzard was getting worse, the world dissolving into a maelstrom of white and gray. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her numb resolve. This was not a normal storm. It was a beast. She reached the riverbank, the water a churning, black serpent choked with plates of ice. She carefully made her way to a familiar spot where a flat rock usually offered a safe place to stand. But the snow hid everything, turning the familiar landscape into a treacherous mystery. She took a careful step, testing the ground. It seemed to hold. She took another, leaning down to dip the first bucket into the freezing water. The world tilted. A sickening crack echoed under her feet. The ground gave way, not snow-covered earth, but a thin shelf of ice. She cried out, a small, choked sound swallowed by the storm. Icy water surged over her boots, instantly numbing her legs. She scrambled, her raw hands clawing at the broken edge of the ice, but it crumbled beneath her grip. The current, impossibly strong, caught her, pulling her in. She was falling. No, she was being dragged. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, a giant's fist closing around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Panic was a wild animal clawing at her throat. She fought against the river's pull, her heavy, waterlogged cloak acting as an anchor, dragging her down, down into the crushing, suffocating darkness. This is it, she thought, a strange calm settling over the terror. This is how it ends. Lyra would get her wish. No one would even look for her until the thaw. Her head struck something hard, a rock, a log. Pain exploded behind her eyes. The darkness deepened, no longer just the absence of light, but a final, welcoming void. Her fight ebbed away. The cold was winning. Just as her consciousness began to fray completely, a new sensation broke through the frozen haze. Heat. A furnace-like warmth that had no place in this icy hell. Strong arms encircled her, lifting her from the water with an ease that was breathtaking. She was pulled against a chest so broad and solid it felt like a mountain. The cold receded, driven back by the sheer, impossible heat radiating from the body that held her. Her head lolled back. Through the swirling snow, she saw a face. It was a face carved from harsh lines and predatory beauty, framed by a mane of night-dark hair dusted with snow. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were molten gold, glowing with an inner fire, a stark contrast to the frozen world around them. He was huge, a giant of a man clad in dark furs, but he was wounded. A deep gash in his side bled sluggishly, the dark blood a shocking stain against the white snow. He seemed to be leaning against a large boulder, as if he had been taking shelter there when she was swept by. Fear and awe warred within her. He was not from her pack. She had never seen anyone like him. He was something more, something ancient and powerful. Her chattering teeth made it impossible to speak. Her body was a block of ice, but where his skin touched hers, a strange warmth was beginning to spread. She was dying. She knew it. He looked down at her, his golden eyes intense, searching. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through her very soul. He shifted his grip, his hand brushing against the exposed skin of her neck where her cloak had been torn. The moment his fingers made contact with her bare skin, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A shockwave of pure energy slammed through her, white-hot and blinding. A scream tore from her throat, but it was lost in the roar of power that surged between them. It felt like being struck by lightning. Searing pain, sharp and unbearable, erupted on her shoulder. It was a firebrand, a hot iron pressing into her flesh, marking her. She writhed in his arms, a cry of agony finally escaping her lips. Through the haze of pain, she saw the mark on her own skin. It was glowing, a soft, ethereal light under her torn tunic. An intricate pattern of swirls and lines, like a stylized wolf and a crescent moon, was burning itself into her flesh. She looked up at him, her vision swimming. His golden eyes were wider now, blazing with an emotion she couldn't name. It was shock, recognition, and something else. Something fierce and possessive that terrified her to her core. His lips parted, a puff of white mist in the cold air. He spoke a single word, his voice deep as thunder, a command that resonated not in her ears, but in the very marrow of her bones. Mine. Her mind reeled. Confusion and terror swamped her. What was happening? This mark, this man, this feeling. It was as if a string had been tied from her soul to his, pulling her toward him, telling her she belonged. Her body traitorously responded. The shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, humming warmth that originated from the point of his touch. Her instincts screamed that this was safety, this was home. Her mind screamed that this was madness. He was a stranger, a wounded giant with fire in his eyes. He pulled her closer, his grip firm but not crushing. He tucked her head against his chest, shielding her from the wind. The scent of pine, winter storms, and blood filled her senses. It should have been frightening. It was not. "I have you," he murmured, his voice softer now, a low rumble against her ear. The world began to fade again, but this time it wasn't the cold darkness of the river. It was a gentle slide into unconsciousness, cradled in impossible warmth, the word mine echoing in the ruins of her thoughts. She woke to the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. The world was soft. She was lying on a bed of thick furs, a heavy blanket covering her. For the first time in her memory, she was not cold. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth nearby, casting dancing shadows on the walls of a large, well-appointed tent. Panic flared. Where was she? She sat up, her head spinning. She was wearing a simple, soft tunic of dark wool. It was not hers. Her old, ragged clothes were gone. Her hand flew to her shoulder. She pushed aside the collar of the tunic. There, stark against her pale skin, was the mark. It was no longer glowing, but it was undeniably there. A delicate, intricate tattoo of black ink that seemed to move, to breathe, with a life of its own. It didn't hurt anymore. Instead, a gentle warmth emanated from it, a constant, comforting presence. The flap of the tent opened. The giant from the storm entered, ducking his head to clear the entrance. He was even larger than she remembered, broad-shouldered and powerful, moving with a predator's grace despite the bandage now wrapped tightly around his torso. His molten gold eyes found hers instantly. Fear, sharp and immediate, seized her. She scrambled back on the furs, pulling the blanket up to her chin like a shield. He stopped, his expression unreadable. He held up his hands, showing they were empty. "I will not harm you." His voice was the same deep rumble, but it was quiet, carefully controlled. He gestured to a small wooden table near the fire. On it sat a plate of roasted meat, bread, and a steaming mug. "You need to eat." Her stomach clenched with a painful spasm of hunger betraying her. She hadn't eaten a full meal in days, but the fear was stronger. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you do to me?" He took a slow step closer. The air in the tent seemed to crackle with his presence. My name is Kale. I am the Alpha King of the Northern clans. Alpha King. The words hit her like a physical blow. The supreme ruler of all the packs, a figure of myth and legend, a man so powerful his name was only ever spoken in hushed, reverent tones, and she was in his tent. As for what I did, he continued, his golden eyes fixed on her shoulder, I did nothing. The bond chose. The bond? Her confusion was a thick fog. The mark. It is a claiming mark, he said simply, as if explaining the weather. It appears when a wolf finds his fated mate. I have been searching for you for a very long time. Mate. Fated mate. The words made no sense. Her? A worthless, half-starved Omega? The mate of the Alpha King? It was a joke. A cruel, impossible joke. No, she said, shaking her head. You're mistaken. I'm no one. The words were a familiar refrain, the cornerstone of her existence. His smile was a faint, sad thing that did not reach his eyes. You are not no one. You are her. You are mine. He moved to the table and brought the plate of food to the bed, setting it down before her. Sit down, he said, his voice soft but absolute. It was not a request. Hesitantly, she obeyed, her body moving before her mind could protest. The scent of the food was dizzying. She picked up a piece of bread, her hand trembling. My men found us shortly after you lost consciousness, he explained, watching her with that unnerving intensity. They brought us here to my winter camp. You were near death. You were bleeding, she remembered, the image of the dark blood on the snow suddenly vivid. An ambush by the Ember Covenant, he said, his voice hardening, his eyes flashing like embers. Fools who think they can challenge me. They will be dealt with. The Ember Covenant. A dark cult, Whispers said. Her old pack Alpha had spoken of them with fear. They were shadows that stole wolves in the night. She took a bite of the bread. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Tears prang her eyes, hot and shameful. She was crying over a piece of bread. What is your name? He asked gently. Elara, she mumbled around the mouthful. Elara, he repeated, and the way he said it made her name sound like something precious. It sent a strange shiver down her spine. For the next few days, she lived in a state of suspended disbelief. She stayed in the king's tent, a place of impossible warmth and comfort. He gave her space, never pressing, never touching her again, but his presence was a constant, powerful force. His men, warriors with hardened faces and scars, treated her with a startling reverence, bowing their heads when she passed, calling her Luna. It was too much. She felt like a fraud, a little brown mouse dressed in queen's robes. The self-doubt was a crushing weight. This was all a mistake. Soon he would realize it. He would see her for what she was, a pathetic, useless Omega, and cast her aside. The thought was a cold dread that lived in her stomach. One afternoon, while Kael was in a meeting with his war council, a young woman brought her a new set of clothes. They were beautiful traveling leathers, soft and supple, with a thick, fur-lined cloak. The king said you are to be ready to travel at dusk, Luna, the woman said with a kind smile. We are returning to the capital. The capital. A real home. A new life. A desperate, fragile hope began to bloom in Alara's chest, a hope she was terrified to embrace. Could this be real? Could she truly leave her old life behind? She was dressing, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar buckles, when she heard voices outside the tent. Hushed, urgent voices. Saw it with my own eyes. A scout from the Blackwood pack. He was watching the camp. Blackwood? That's Alpha Valerius's territory. He's ambitious. And his daughter... Alara froze. Blackwood. That was her pack. Valerius was her alpha. Lyra was his daughter. They knew. They knew she was here. The hope in her chest withered and died, replaced by icy terror. A familiar, hated scent cut through the air. Winter rose perfume. The tent flap was ripped open. Lyra stood there, her beautiful face twisted in a mask of rage and jealousy. Behind her stood her father, Valerius, and two of his largest enforcers. "There you are, you little gutter rat," Lyra snarled. Her eyes fell to the mark, barely visible at the collar of Alara's tunic. A flicker of something, greed, triumph, flashed in her eyes. "What is the meaning of this, Valerius?" a deep voice demanded. One of Cale's guards, a mountain of a man named Fendrel, stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. Valerius gave a greasy smile. "Just retrieving my property. This Omega belongs to my pack. She ran away." "She is the king's mate," Fendrel growled. "She belongs nowhere but by his side." "A misunderstanding, I'm sure," Valerius said smoothly, but his eyes were cold and calculating. He was looking at Alara not as a person, but as a prize, a key. A worthless Omega claimed by the king? He must be desperate. Or perhaps his judgment is failing. We will take her and present her to him ourselves to clear this all up. It was a lie, a transparent one. They had no intention of presenting her to Cale. They wanted her. "You will not touch her," Fendrel warned, drawing his blade. But Valerius had planned this. At his signal, a dozen more Blackwood wolves emerged from the trees surrounding the tent. Cale's guards were outnumbered. "Take her," Valerius commanded. Lyra surged forward, her fingers digging into Alara's arm like talons. "You think you can escape what you are?" she hissed in her ear. "You are nothing. You will always be nothing." Alara was paralyzed by the old familiar fear. Lyra's touch, her voice, it plunged her right back into the cold, hopeless world she had just begun to escape. She was weak. She was worthless. She was nothing. Fendrel roared and charged, but he was overwhelmed. The Blackwood enforcers grabbed Alara, their hands rough and bruising. She cried out, a thin, desperate sound. "Cale!" They dragged her from the tent, away from the fire, away from the warmth. Lyra slapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. "He can't help you now," she whispered. They forced her through the woods, moving quickly. One of the enforcers clamped a cold, heavy manacle around her wrist. It was silver. The moment the metal touched her skin, a sickening wave of nausea and pain washed over her. The gentle warmth from the soul mark vanished, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. The connection to Cale, that constant humming presence at the back of her mind, flickered and dimmed, almost to nothing. The separation was agony. It was a physical tearing, as if part of her soul was being ripped away. A cry of pure anguish was muffled by Lyra's hand. They didn't take her back to the Blackwood camp. They moved deeper into the wilderness, towards the jagged, forbidding peaks that marked the edge of the known territories, the domain of the Ember Covenant. Valerius was not just ambitious. He was a traitor. They arrived hours later at a hidden fortress carved into the black rock of a mountain. Shadowy figures in dark robes met them, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They moved with a silent, unsettling purpose. Alara was dragged through cold stone corridors, the air thick with the smell of unnatural magic and old fear. She was thrown into a cell. It was small, damp, and utterly dark. The stone floor was freezing, a brutal reminder of her old life. The silver manacle, chained to the wall, felt like it was leeching the very life from her, severing her from the one source of warmth she had ever known. Soul-crushing despair washed over her. It had all been a dream, a brief, beautiful illusion of hope. This was her reality. The cold, the dark, the pain. Lyra was right. She was nothing, and she would die here, alone. She curled into a tight ball on the floor, the cold seeping into her bones. The ache in her shoulder was a constant, agonizing pulse. The bond was fraying. She could feel it. It felt like dying. Days or hours passed. She lost track. Time was a meaningless river of darkness and misery. They gave her stale bread and foul water, just enough to keep her alive. Valerius came once, his eyes gleaming with greed. "The Shadow Lord is pleased," he'd said, his voice echoing in the small cell. "The bond weakens. When it breaks, the king's power will falter. He will be vulnerable. And the Ember Covenant will rise, with me at its head." So that was it. She was just a tool, a weapon to be used against the man who had called her his mate, the man who had saved her. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. Later, a new figure entered her cell. He moved with an unnerving silence, a vortex of cold in the already freezing air. He wore the dark robes of the Covenant, but his hood was down. His face was unnaturally pale, his eyes black pits of nothingness. This was not Valerius. This was a true master of this dark place. "So this is the king's great love," the man said, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. He circled her like a predator. "A frightened little thing. Hardly seems worth the trouble." He knelt before her, his presence suffocating. "I am Lord Malachor, and I will be your new king." He reached out a hand, his fingers long and skeletal. "Your Alpha King is sentimental. His power is tied to this ridiculous notion of a soul bond, a fatal flaw. Once I sever it and take the power within you for myself, he will be nothing more than a memory." He saw the defiance flicker in her eyes. "Oh, you don't know, do you?" He chuckled, a horrible, grating sound. "That mark is not just a claim. It is a key. It is meant to unlock the power dormant in your bloodline, a power of life, of creation, the perfect opposite to what we command." Power? In her? The idea was so ludicrous she almost laughed. He was insane. "He wanted you to discover it on your own," Malachor mused, "to nurture it. How romantic. I, on the other hand, will simply rip it out of you." He left her then, plunging her back into darkness and a deeper despair. He was going to use her, break her, and destroy Kale in the process. All her life she had been helpless, and now, when it mattered most, she was more helpless than ever. She closed her eyes, trying to find that tiny, flickering thread that connected her to Kale. It was almost gone, a faint spark in a universe of darkness. She focused on it, pouring all her will, all her desperation into that single point. Kale. She didn't say it aloud. She thought it, screamed it in the silent space of her own mind. "Please." For a moment, there was nothing. The silence pressed in, heavy and final. Then, a whisper. So faint she thought she had imagined it. It was not a sound but a feeling, a flicker of warmth against the crushing cold. Alara. His voice. It was there, a ghost on the frayed edge of the bond, weak, strained, but it was him. "Hold on." The thought was infused with a desperate fury, a promise of violence that was somehow the most comforting thing she had ever felt. I am coming. The connection faded, leaving her alone again. But something had changed. A tiny seed of hope had been planted in the barren wasteland of her despair. He knew. He was coming. She had to hold on. The time for the ritual came. 2 robed figures dragged her from the cell, her legs barely able to support her. They took her to a vast cavern lit by the eerie green glow of phosphorescent fungi. In the center of the cavern, a circle of complex runes was carved into the floor. Lord Malachor stood in the middle, waiting. Valerius and Lyra stood off to the side, their faces alight with greedy anticipation. They forced her into the center of the circle, chaining her silver manacle to a hook in the floor. The air was thick with power, a dark, cloying energy that made her skin crawl. "Let us begin," Malachor announced, his voice echoing in the cavern. He began to chant in a language that hurt her ears, the words twisting the air around them. The runes on the floor began to glow with a sickly black light. The energy coiled, focusing on her, on the mark on her shoulder. Pain, unlike anything she had ever known, erupted from the soul mark. It was not the clean fire of its creation, but a vile, tearing agony. It was as if claws were digging into her soul, trying to rip it from her body. She screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure torment. The bond frayed violently. She could feel Kale's answering agony, a distant echo of her own. The ritual was working. It was severing them. "Yes," Malachor hissed, his eyes glowing with triumph. "The power is stirring. It is almost mine." Tears streamed down her face. She was breaking. She couldn't hold on. He was going to win. "I am coming." The memory of his promise was a final defiant spark. No, she would not let this happen. And then the world exploded. Not with magic, but with sound and force. An entire section of the cavern wall blew inward in a shower of rock and dust. A figure stood silhouetted against the sudden intrusion of the cold night air. A figure of pure, unrestrained fury. It was Kale. His golden eyes were not just glowing. They were blazing infernos. A low, guttural roar of absolute rage tore from his throat, a sound that promised death. He was no longer a king. He was a reckoning. Behind him, his warriors poured into the cavern, their howls joining his, a symphony of vengeance. The battle began instantly, a chaotic clash of steel and shadow. Kale ignored everyone else. His burning gaze was locked on Alara, on her pain. He moved, a blur of motion, a dark whirlwind of destruction. The robed cultists who tried to stop him were thrown aside like dolls, broken and discarded. Valerius paled, his arrogance vanishing in a wave of pure terror. "Lord Malachor!" he shrieked. Malachor broke his chant, turning to face the enraged Alpha King. "So, the whelp comes for his pet," he sneered, raising a hand. A bolt of black energy shot towards Kale. Kale didn't even try to dodge. He took the blast head-on, staggering for a moment before roaring and charging through it, his skin smoking where the dark magic touched him. He was a force of nature, unstoppable. He was almost to her. He was going to save her. But Malachor was cunning. He materialized directly in Kale's path, a blade of pure shadow in his hand. They met in a cataclysmic clash of power. The cavern shook with the force of their blows. Kale was stronger, a beast of physical might. But Malachor was slippery, his dark magic weaving a treacherous web. Alara could only watch, chained and helpless, as they fought. Cale fought with the desperation of a male whose mate was threatened. He landed a blow that sent Malachor reeling, but the Shadow Lord was quick. He fainted, and as Cale pressed his advantage, Malachor's shadow blade lashed out, sinking deep into Cale's side, the same side that had been wounded before. Cale bellowed in pain, stumbling to one knee. His golden eyes flickered, the inferno dimming for a fraction of a second. He was hurt. He was in danger. Because of her. Something inside Alara broke. It was not a gentle cracking, it was a shattering. The years of being called worthless, the pain of the cold, Lyra's sneering face, the agony of the ritual, the terror of the dungeon, and now the sight of Cale, her king, her mate, falling because of her. It all coalesced into a single, incandescent point of pure, untamed rage. A power she never knew she possessed, the power Malachor had tried to steal, erupted from her. It was not dark. It was light. A brilliant, cleansing, blinding light that exploded from her body in a silent, unstoppable wave. The silver manacle on her wrist didn't just break, it vaporized into dust. The dark runes on the floor were scoured clean, vanishing as if they had never been. The lesser cultists caught in the blast screamed as the pure light touched them, their shadow forms dissolving into nothing. The light washed over Cale, and she felt his wound begin to close, his strength surging back. It struck Malachor like a physical blow, sending him flying backwards, his dark robes smoking as the light burned away his shadows. Silence fell in the cavern, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Everyone, Cale's warriors, the remaining cultists, Valerius, Lyra, stared at her. Alara rose to her feet. The light swirled around her, a corona of soft, white gold energy. She was no longer the shivering, frightened Omega. Her fear was gone, burned away by the fire of her newfound power. She felt whole, powerful. Malachor struggled to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Impossible! A worthless stray! You are nothing!" Alara took a step forward, the floor cracking under her feet. Her voice when she spoke was not a whisper. It was clear, resonant, and filled with an absolute authority that shook the very stones of the cavern. "I am his," she declared, her eyes now glowing with a soft light of their own, locking with Cale's. "And he is mine." She turned her gaze to Malachor, a queen passing sentence. "I am Alara of the northern clans, and you will not touch my king." She raised her hand. The light coalesced, forming a spear of pure energy. She had no idea how she was doing it. She just knew it was right. "You are not worthy of this power," Malachor shrieked, gathering his own depleted shadows for a final attack. "It was never for you," she said, and with a final declarative cry, she thrust her hand forward. The spear of light shot across the cavern. It did not just strike Malachor, it pierced him, enveloped him. He screamed, a long, drawn-out sound of utter agony as the pure, life-giving energy unmade his very essence, which was built on shadow and death. His form wavered, dissolved, and then, with a final, pathetic whimper, he was gone. Not even dust remained. The light around Alara slowly faded, leaving her standing in the sudden, profound silence. The battle was over. Lyra and Valeria stood frozen, their faces monuments to abject terror. They had come to bargain with a demon, and had instead witnessed the birth of a goddess. Kale's warriors simply stared, their weapons lowered, their expressions a mixture of shock and profound awe. Then Kale moved. He stumbled the last few feet towards her, his body still healing, his golden eyes filled with a reverence that made her heart ache. He reached her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, and for all time. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of pain or fear. "You found me," she replied, her voice trembling. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The world narrowed to just the two of them, to the space between their breaths. The bond, no longer frayed or painful, surged between them, a powerful, vibrant current of pure love and belonging. It was whole. It was stronger than ever. She lifted a hand, her fingers tracing the intricate mark on her shoulder. It was warm, thrumming with life. Then, acting on an instinct she didn't know she had, she pressed that same hand flat against his chest, over his heart. "Mine," she whispered, claiming him as he had claimed her. A gasp escaped his lips. Beneath her palm, a brilliant golden light bloomed. When she pulled her hand away, a mark glowed on his skin, a perfect mirror image of her own. The bond was complete. A circle. A two-way street forged not just by fate, but by choice. By her choice. The pain in his eyes was gone, replaced by a look of such profound, healing love that it took her breath away. He was not just a king. He was her Kale, and she was his Alara. He swept her into his arms, holding her tight against him. For a long moment they just stood there, wrapped in each other, the chaos and violence around them fading into insignificance. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling his scent, pine, storm, and him. It was the scent of home. Finally, he pulled back, though he kept one arm securely around her waist. He turned to face his men, who were now kneeling, their heads bowed. Then he looked past them, his gaze falling on Valerius and Lyra, who were trying to shrink into the shadows. His voice, when he spoke, was cold as the grave. "Seize the traitors!" His warriors moved instantly, dragging the former Alpha and his daughter forward. Lyra was sobbing, pleading. Valerius was silent, his face ashen. "They will be brought back to the capital to face the king's justice," Kale declared. He looked down at Alara. "Their fate is for their queen to decide." The words hung in the air. Queen. He had called her queen in front of everyone, in front of the people who had tormented her. Lyra's head snapped up, her eyes wide with horrified disbelief. Alara looked at the woman who had made her life a living hell. She felt no hatred, no desire for revenge. She just felt pity. A vast, weary pity for someone so small and cruel. "Their pack will have a new alpha," Alara said, her voice steady. "One who is just. Their fate is to be forgotten." Banishment. Obscurity. To be made invisible just as they had tried to make her. It was a fate worse than death for people like them. Kale nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He turned, his arm still a warm, solid weight around her. He led her from the cavern of death and shadow, out into the clean, cold air of the mountainside. His entire army was assembled, a sea of hardened warriors. As they emerged, a ripple went through the ranks. One by one, then in a great wave, they knelt. Every single one of them. On one knee, their heads bowed, their fists over their hearts. A silent, unified oath of fealty to him and to her. Kale raised his voice, and it carried across the mountainside, filled with pride and absolute authority. "Behold your queen!" A roar of approval went up from the kneeling army, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It was a sound of acceptance, of loyalty, of joy. Alara stood beside her king, her mate, and looked out at the faces of her new people. There was no scorn, no pity, no disgust. Only reverence, only awe. The journey back to the capital, Vargard, was a blur. She rode beside Kale, no longer a prisoner, but a monarch. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vibrant. She was seeing it all through new eyes. When they crested the final ridge, she saw it. Vargard was not a grim fortress, but a sprawling city of stone and timber built in the heart of a vast, ancient forest. At its center, a castle of pale gray stone reached for the sky, its towers draped in banners that fluttered in the wind. It was beautiful. It was home. As they rode through the city gates, people poured into the streets. They cheered, they threw winter blossoms, their faces alight with joy at the safe return of their king. And as they saw her, riding at his side, the cheering only grew louder. Kale leaned over, his voice a private rumble just for her. "Welcome home, my love." She looked at him, at the adoration in his molten gold eyes. She looked at the castle that was now her home, at the people who were now her people. The cold, broken girl who chopped wood in the snow was a ghost, a memory from another life. She was not worthless. She was not invisible. She was loved. She was powerful. She was the queen. And she was, finally, completely home.